Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture in which we'll introduce you to wisdom literature and discuss Proverbs chapters 1 to 9. Let's begin by asking a simple-minded question. What is wisdom? Let me give you three classic scholarly definitions of this term. First, from Gerhard von Rad, experiential knowledge, the understanding of the world and of life, and not least, the understanding of reality. The British Old Testament scholar R.N. Whybray writes that wisdom is, quote, the ability to get on in the world, to adapt oneself to circumstances, to deal with difficult situations. It's also, quote, an intellectual quality which provides the key to happiness and success, to life in its widest sense. And finally, a superior degree of intelligence, natural or acquired, which confers life. Finally, Roland Murphy, in two successive publications, describes wisdom as, quote, the effort to discover order in human life, and, quote, the lessons and insights of experiences on the basis of human conduct. So by discussing wisdom broadly, I'm hoping to give you the impression that wisdom is not simply a pursuit that one finds in biblical literature. Here I'd just like to point out the prevalence of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East. That is, we have wisdom literature from Egypt, we have examples from Mesopotamia, from Assyria, and we know about these examples from various archaeological discoveries. So it's very important to realize, as Kathleen O'Connor points out in her text, The Wisdom Literature, that, quote, as a consequence of comparative studies, it is clear that Israel's own wisdom books, Proverbs, Job, the Book of Qoheleth, or Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, Sirach, and the Wisdom of Solomon, that these wisdom books belong within a broad current of international thinking and literary production. She continues and notes that we find, not only in Old Testament literature, but also in that ancient Near Eastern literature in general, what she calls, quote, the common concern of wisdom thinkers, that is, human experience. From the perceptions which they shared with their neighbors, the sages of Israel drew language and ideas to express their own conceptual world, at once both international and specific in character. And she concludes by writing, it is in the context of these international human concerns and perennial human dilemmas that Israel articulates its particular experience of faith. Put differently, we should understand that the understanding of wisdom, the pursuit of wisdom, and even the genre of wisdom literature itself that we find in Old Testament literature draws heavily on other ancient Near Eastern thought and literature. Speaking of literature, now that we've talked about wisdom and talked about its ancient Near Eastern background, how might we define wisdom literature? In his classic introductory textbook, Old Testament Wisdom and Introduction, James Crenshaw writes, quote, formally, wisdom consists of proverbial sentences or instruction, debate, intellectual reflection. Thematically, wisdom comprises self-evident intuitions about mastering life for human betterment, groping after life's secrets with regards to innocent suffering, grappling with finitude, a quest for truth concealed in the created world and manifested in a feminine persona. When a marriage between form and content exists, then we have wisdom literature. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, we have wonderful examples of wisdom literature within the Old Testament. We have 4 books that are usually grouped together and discussed as examples of wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes or Qoheleth, the book of Job, and the poetic piece called the Song of Songs. Now, if you're Catholic, in your deuterocanonical texts, what Protestants might refer to as their Apocrypha, there are also a few texts that we would classify as wisdom literature, particularly the Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. Now it's time for us to get our hands dirty by looking at some specific primary texts, and we're going to examine Proverbs 1 to 9 specifically. Most scholars see Proverbs 1 to 9 as representing a homogeneous block of text, so that we're fairly certain that these chapters hang together both chronologically and thematically and can stand alone from the rest of the book or be read in concert with the rest of the book. But for time's sake, we're just going to look at chapters 1 to 9. And we're going to begin by looking at the introduction in chapter 1, verses 2 to 6. One of the first things we notice about this introduction in Proverbs is the emphasis on pragmatism. That is, the literature that's being introduced has an obvious and practical purpose that's set out by the author in verses 2 to 6. So, what are these pragmatic purposes? Take a minute, read through verses 2 to 6, and ask yourself, what does the author hope the reader will gain through engaging this literature? What qualities are emphasized in these verses? Second, the issue of the fear of the Lord. This is clearly a reiterated theme that bookends chapters 1 to 9. What I mean by that is we encounter it first in chapter 1, verse 7, and then we see it again in chapter 9, verse 10. So what does it mean when the author says, quote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge," end quote? What kind of fear are we talking about here? Is this the fear associated with a tyrant, a despot? Or might this fear be something like how the Quran, the holy revealed scripture of Islam, might this fear be something like how the Quran understands God? That is, God is so all-powerful and all-knowing that fear, or perhaps better, awe, that is A-W-E, awe, perhaps that's the only appropriate response to the magnificence of God. In that sense, fear of the Lord might be something like a thesis for Proverbs 1 to 9, in that all of the arguments the author tries to make in the remainder of these chapters begins with a proper recognition of the character of God and the role that God has played and continues to play in creation. The third, one of the most curious characteristics of Proverbs 1 to 9 is that wisdom is presented as an anthropomorphic character. That is, wisdom speaks in both chapter 1 and chapter 8. In chapter 1, wisdom stands at the entrance to the gate of the city. This is where business would normally be conducted, and wisdom announces to everyone within earshot that they're in a sorry state indeed because they have ignored her and have not feared the Lord. The speech in chapter 8 is much more expansive, dealing as it does with wisdom's role in creation. Lady Wisdom, or as our British friends call her, Dame Wisdom, announces in chapter 8, verses 22 to 31, that she was the first thing created or acquired by God in the process of creation, and that she worked alongside him, quote, like a master worker, end quote. The implication here seems obvious. Wisdom is embedded in the very created order that God sustains. More particularly, it is only through wisdom that creation originated and is sustained. As such, if one wants to understand wisdom, one must understand creation and vice versa. I'd like to talk a minute about Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22 specifically. This is the opening of Lady Wisdom's first speech in Proverbs 1 to 9, and in it she asks two seemingly simple questions. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? End quote. It's worth asking a follow-up question after hearing wisdom's rhetorical questions. That is, what does wisdom demand of the one who would be wise? Now, this is an overriding theme in chapters 1 to 9 of Proverbs, though here, what wisdom demands seems rather obvious. Wisdom demands intellectual knowledge. This claim is buttressed by examining chapter 1, verse 29, a claim made in that same first speech by Lady Wisdom, in which she says that there will be those whom she doesn't aid or doesn't help, quote, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, end quote. In the past decade or so, it's become alarmingly commonplace in our civil public discourse to disregard not simply academic experts, but to state a willful mistrust of those who are educated and intellectual acuity in general. Leaving aside for the moment the disastrous consequences that result from those kinds of public attitudes and sentiments, it seems very obvious that this disregard is not in keeping with the claims that wisdom makes in Proverbs 1. Put differently, if one wants to be wise, then one must pursue, at least in some degree, what we like to call a life of the mind. Another curious characteristic of Proverbs 1 to 9 are 4 sections in which the author warns his hearer or his reader about what he calls a strange or loose woman. In this slide and in the next, what I've done is to try and collect some of the more important characteristics and or descriptions which the author provides of these elusive, strange women. As you can see, there are several repeated characteristics. One of these is the smooth talk or persuasive speech that the woman employs in order to seduce men. She's referred to as an adulteress, and the author also warns that any man who follows her is courting death. And as we saw in our lecture on prophetic literature, women are often used as metaphors for negative or discordant behavior. In her work, Carol R. Fontaine calls the strange woman Lady Wisdom's evil twin, and notes, quote, the literary imagery that describes her combines several features, some of which we have just seen. She is viewed as an adulteress who breaks Israelite laws, as a prostitute. She is spoken of in language typical of goddesses, and of one who devalues the meaning of cultic religious observances. Any wrongdoing that may result from an encounter with her is attributed to her powers of persuasion and seductive bearing. The man's complicity and cooperation, other than stupidity, go unnoted. Now, I've already mentioned the close connection between Lady Wisdom and creation that we saw in chapter 8. In chapter 3, though, the connection between creation and wisdom is also explored in verses 19 through 20. Quote, the Lord, by wisdom, founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. By his knowledge, the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew. Now, as we saw in Lady Wisdom's speech in chapter 8, it appears that creation is only possible through wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, as without these characteristics, it appears that God would have been unable to have completed the act of creation. As such, for the author and his pupils, wisdom and creation are not just closely related, they go hand in hand. I also mentioned earlier that Proverbs is nothing if not practical. As an example of how wisdom functions in everyday situations in the natural environment, the author in chapter 6 provides his pupil an illustration of how wisdom can be gleaned from observing nature. The specific example here is the activity of ants, and it seems that the author, on the one hand, wants their pupils to understand that, like the ants, that they should see work and community as positive values. On the other hand, this is an example of how the author wants his pupils to understand how they know what they know. That is, they gain knowledge and wisdom by observing and by drawing inferences from what they observe. After all, we've seen the close connection between wisdom and creation. So if one wishes to be wise, one must be able to observe nature and draw a proper inference from it. Finally, in previous mini lectures, we've discussed the influence of the Deuteronomistic history on the theological outlook of much of Old Testament literature. That influence is felt even here in Proverbs. In the first 3 texts that I list on the slide, the language and thematic overlap is obvious. The teacher tells his pupils that his father taught him to, quote, keep my commandments and live, end quote. The same sentiment is echoed in chapter 7, verse 2. The teacher also exhorts his pupils, quote, do not swerve to the right or to the left, turn your foot away from evil. This is not only familiar sounding, as it very clearly echoes the 2 ways theology that we've discussed before, but the author of Proverbs puts his own unique twist on this time-worn outlook when he discusses the strange or the loose woman. That is, this strange or loose woman represents virtually all of the negative behaviors that the Deuteronomistic historian would associate with abandoning the commandments and the ordinances of God. So what conclusions can we draw about Proverbs 1-9? In his commentary on Proverbs, Richard J. Clifford notes 2 ways in which the material in Proverbs 1-9 differs from other examples of ancient Near Eastern wisdom. He writes, quote, first, they are less specific than their Egyptian or Mesopotamian prototypes. They urge readers to seek wisdom rather than to do or not to do specific actions. To put it another way, Proverbs emphasizes character rather than acts. And second, the strong personification of wisdom in Proverbs 1, 8, and 9, and its vivid descriptions of wisdom's 2 enemies, deceptive men and the deceptive woman, creates a metaphorical level of discourse that was unknown in earlier wisdom literature. More generally, Roland Murphy writes in his text, The Tree of Life, quote, when the psalmists pray to be saved, they seek restoration to a full life in the here and now. Such is also the understanding in Proverbs. Personified wisdom has a kerygma, that is, a teaching. She announces security and life. The teaching of the wise is a fountain of life. This is also applied to fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. The symbols of fountain and tree of life are frequent. Concretely, life means riches and honor, a good name, a long existence of many years. In sum, the perspective of Proverbs is the betterment of life in the here and now through an acceptance and practice of the teachings of wisdom which will ensure life. And I'd like to conclude this mini lecture by asking you to consider 6 questions. First, what is the fear of the Lord? Second, how are women viewed in Proverbs 1-9? How does this compare with how women are viewed in prophetic literature? How is wisdom portrayed? And I would urge you to peruse the additional non-canonical literature that I've listed here. The 24th chapter of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, and selected texts from the Wisdom of Solomon. Fourth, what is wisdom, and how do we know what we know? Fifth, what does wisdom have to do with creation? And sixth, what does two-ways theology have to do with wisdom? I hope you found this mini lecture helpful, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.